Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. We have a celebrity guest with us today. It's Patrick Buchanan, who is a legendary political commentator, best-selling author, and senior advisor to 3 former presidents. Great to have you here, Pat.
Thank you very much, Lois.
We will be discussing Pat Buchanan's latest book, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority, which has been praised by such newspapers as the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Washington Post. Published in advance of the 40th anniversary of President Nixon's resignation, The Greatest Comeback is an intimate portrayal of the 37th president and a fascinating fly-on-the-wall account of how this master politician reconstructed a broken career, revived a broken party, and created a new majority. In addition to authoring 11 books, Pat ran for the Republican nomination for president in 1992 and 1996 and was the Reform Party's presidential candidate in 2000. Also, he is a syndicated columnist and the founding member of 3 acclaimed public affairs TV programs, including NBC's The McLaughlin Group and CNN's Crossfire and Capital Gang. Pat, how did you meet President Nixon, and how did you gain his trust to become one of his top advisors?
I first met Richard Nixon when I was about 14 or 15 years old at the Burning Tree Country Club, the all-men's club out here in Montgomery County, Maryland, where Dwight Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, the president, he used to play golf, and I was on the caddy log one day, sitting there late in the afternoon. The other caddies had taken out their bags, and out comes this plaid bag, and it's put on the rack, and the assistant pro looks over at me and my friend Pete Cook, and he says, "Come on over." And we went around 18 holes with the Vice President of the United States, Richard Milhouse Nixon, I guess when he was in his early 40s, and he had been the second youngest vice president in history, and he was not Arnold Palmer.
Oh, he was not a good he was not a good golfer then, no?
He was enjoying himself, banging the ball all over the place. That's right.
But it was kind of a thrill for you, I suppose.
Oh, it was a thrill. I got up to the street corner and I was telling the buddies, I said, look, I was around with the Vice President of the United States for 4 hours today, so it was quite an event. And then it so happened that about a dozen years later, I was a very young editorial writer in St. Louis. And the former Vice President of the United States was speaking over in Belleville, Illinois. And this was 1965, right after the Goldwater disaster had really torn the Republican Party had come apart and collapsed. It had never been defeated so badly since 1936.
Sure, yes.
And so I went up to him at a cocktail party I got myself invited to, and I said, "Mr. Vice President, if you're going to run in 1968, I'd like to get aboard early." And he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm the assistant editorial editor of the Globe Democrat." He said, "No, what do you do? Not my title." And so I told him, because we only got 2 editorial writers, and the big liberal Post-Dispatch had 8 editorial writers. I said, I write on domestic subjects, foreign policy, local, gubernatorial politics. I write on everything, culture. And so he was impressed.
Yes.
And all the way out to Lambert, St. Louis the next morning, he questioned my friend Don Hess, who had the party, the cartoonist for the Globe Democrat. And about 2 weeks later, I get a call, and the familiar voice from New York says, "I'd like you to come to New York so we can continue this discussion." So I went up there to New York, and I spent 3 hours being grilled by the former Vice President of the United States in his office, which was right beside the New York Stock Exchange. He was the name partner in Nixon Mudge. And after 3 hours, he said, "I'd like to hire you for 1 year." And he offered me a very nice salary, and I said, "I'll take it." And I said, "But you better call my publisher, because he doesn't know I'm here."
Wow. And the good news is your publisher got the call and let you go, right?
He let me go. He didn't have too much of a choice.
That's right, that's right, that's right. Well, you write that you were far more conservative than Richard Nixon, whom you describe as a progressive conservative, but you are a true conservative. I mean, did you move Richard Nixon further to the right politically?
I think I had I don't know that I moved him to the right, but I certainly had a role in bringing Richard Nixon together with the conservative movement. Richard Nixon came into politics in 1946, the famous Alger Hiss case in 47, 48. So he was a national figure and a small c conservative Republican before the conservative movement began really in earnest, the one I belonged to. And that began, I think, in sort of the middle to late 50s with National Review. And so he was not the kind of conservative I was, but he had conservative instincts. And what I did was, a friend of mine and I basically brought Richard Nixon together with that conservative movement in 1966.
Okay.
We brought him into meetings with all the conservative leaders. We brought the conservative columnists in. And Nixon was not part of the Goldwater movement, but we sort of brought together the Goldwater movement along with Richard Nixon, the centrist Republican, and we had ourselves an alliance there that could not be defeated if he ran a good run for the nomination, which he did.
Well, as you have mentioned, Richard Nixon had been a very successful politician early in his career, elected to Congress in 1946 and to the Senate in 1950, and then he became Eisenhower's VP in 1952. But by 1960, he was only 47 years old and had gained vast exposure on the world stage. But he had lost to John F. Kennedy and then the California gubernatorial election in 1962. So he was ready to get back into politics somehow, right?
Right. Well, he had, after 1962, he walked out and told the press, think of all the fun you'll be missing. You don't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore.
That's
because
right.
this is my last press conference. And he gave up politics and he went to New York to practice law. But he was bored with that. He used to tell me, Pat, if I had to practice law the rest of my life, I would be mentally dead in 2 years and physically in 4.
Ooh.
So what he did do in '64, and one of the smartest things he did, and was also consistent with his interests, but was the right thing to do. Goldwater was nominated. The party had been torn apart at the Cow Palace. And Nixon went out in 1964 when Rockefeller abandoned Goldwater and Romney abandoned him and Scranton abandoned him. Nixon campaigned for Goldwater harder than Goldwater campaigned himself. And so at the end of '64, I could see, look, Nixon is a legendary figure already, and he's done all this work for Goldwater. And if we could just bring this Goldwater movement, which had taken over the party, together with the Nixon Republicans, we could win that nomination.
Yes, and you write that Nixon was extremely disciplined. I mean, in 1965, he traveled to 35 states and into 80 congressional districts. I mean, Governor Romney was in the lead for the GOP nomination for president. So what happened?
Well, here's what happened. That was the off-year election, actually, of 1966, right after I joined him in '65. But he campaigned all over the country for these Republicans, all the Republicans, liberal, conservative, moderate, even endorsed Nelson Rockefeller, his old antagonist and adversary. And what happened was, after the Goldwater, we'd lost all those seats, we're down to 140 seats in the House. All of a sudden, there's a 47-seat victory for the Republicans at the end of the campaign. Because we kept baiting Lyndon Johnson and baiting him, he went on a tirade against Nixon right over there in the East Room that reporters said they had never seen before. And then Nixon handled it. He didn't get angry. He said, I have great respect for President Johnson, but these questions on Vietnam need to be answered. And every journalist in the country said, look, whatever you think about Nixon, he's got a right to ask these questions. They're legitimate. And I had worked with Nixon on this famous critique of Lyndon Johnson's communique from Manila, the summit he had gone to. And so Nixon was vaulted in the public eye into a head-to-head with LBJ. And he had won this face-off.
And it was great for his image, wasn't it?
Oh, it was phenomenal. All of a sudden people said, hey, this Nixon really handled it well. Maybe he can make it.
That's right. He's coming back, yeah.
And then he made a brilliant move. He said, the Sunday right before the 1966 election, said, I'm going to take a 6 months moratorium from politics. I'm through with it. I'm going to get no press conference, no political speeches, no political activity. And he went out on 4 foreign trips around the world. I went to the Middle East with him and Africa. But then, as he went out, left, as you mentioned, George Romney had ended '66, was 8 points ahead of Lyndon Johnson. He was leading all the Republicans.
Right.
And so I said, Mr. Nixon, is it wise to step out and let him have a straight run for the nomination without us competing? And Mr. Nixon said in his own way, let him chew on him for a little while.
Well, as he did.
The press corps.
That's right.
And they proceeded to do it.
Exactly. Well, Nixon never had great press coverage. I mean, I read in your book that Nixon felt the press was the enemy. I mean, why did the national press dislike Nixon from his early days in Washington, D.C.?
I think one reason was because he exposed the communist ties of Alger Hiss, who was an icon and a beloved figure of the establishment, tremendously admired young man. and Nixon helped expose him as a Soviet spy in World War II. Secondly, in that era of Harry Truman and Joe McCarthy and Richard Nixon, back when I was about 10 years old in grammar school, it was a very volatile period when America was really bitterly divided. You had the Soviet atom bomb, you had Stalin taking over Eastern Europe, Communists took over China, and everybody was accusing them of having communists in the White House and communists in the administration. Right. And Nixon led the charge there, and so many liberals believed that that was horrible, and they impugned their patriotism. And so they blamed him for that. And then during the 50s, when he was Ike's vice president, he's got to be the bayonet of the Republican Party in those political races in 54 and 58. Then, of course, he ran against the beloved Jack Kennedy, and he lost. And then the press, we said, we've buried him. He's gone, dead and gone.
Dead and gone, that's right.
And then here he comes back, and all of a sudden, here he is taking the oath of office in 1969.
It's amazing. It's amazing. His comeback.
That's the astonishing story and the greatest comeback.
It is. I mean, as you wrote, the Goldwater presidential election in 1964 was a disaster for the Republicans, and Goldwater only had 5 states in the Deep South, and the party had lost 36 House seats, and so Nixon really did help bury Goldwater. But what I'm curious about is, what is the relationship between Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan? Because wasn't Ronald Reagan in California, wasn't he starting to also make a move?
Let me say, the 64 campaign, I mean, I was a conservative, but we knew we were going to get beat, especially after Jack Kennedy had been shot. Country wasn't going to throw out Lyndon Johnson.
Sure.
And so, and Goldwater had made some mistakes, and the press had pounded him, and so he got wiped out, carried 5 states in the South and Arizona. But at the end of the Goldwater campaign, Ronald Reagan took to the airwaves in a famous television address and spoke for Goldwater and conservatism, and the conservatives said, here's our future leader. Ronald Reagan, and so then in 65, when I came with Nixon, I came with him, but 66, Reagan announces for governor of California. And I was telling Nixon, I said, we can beat any of these other candidates, Scranton, Romney, Rockefeller. They're on the left wing of the party. They abandoned Goldwater. We got the Goldwater movement and the Nixon Republicans. We can defeat any one of them. However, this fellow out there in California,
that's right. Ronald Reagan would be tough.
If he came out, he would pull all these conservatives away because he was an electrifying and charismatic figure.
Yes, he was.
And Nixon knew it. And so I was always much more concerned about this fellow out there in California who had become governor. As a matter of fact, Lois, when we got into the 68 campaign, Nixon, we were running behind Humphrey about mid-year, in 5-6 points behind, and I said, we got to find a way to get some Democrats, sir. We're going to have to be bold to win this thing. And I can think of nothing bolder, I wrote in a memo, than putting on the ticket the hero of Bedtime for Bonzo.
That's right.
Which was one of Reagan's last movies where he played with a chimp.
That's right.
But Reagan even then was an electrifying figure, and we knew it would bring excitement to the ticket. And also, when Nixon ran in '68, we had Governor George Wallace of Alabama at one point had 21% of the vote, and he was carrying 7 states, which would have gone to Nixon had he not been in the race. So we had to fight Wallace on the populist right and Humphrey in the center left, and try to push both of them out to a degree, and so we could get enough to win. And
that's right.
Eventually we did with 43%.
And it's amazing. Well, how did he handle Wallace? And what was the impact of George Wallace on Nixon's efforts to influence voters in the South?
Well, Wallace, there was no way we could beat, in the deep southern states, take Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas. Wallace eventually carried those. At one point, he was carrying North Carolina and South Carolina as well. But what Wallace was also carrying, the Deep South, we just couldn't get from him. We wanted to win the Upper South. And that's one reason Nixon picked Agnew, to try to come
from Maryland, the governor of Maryland.
Maryland, to try to help us in Virginia and North Carolina and in Florida and states like that. But what you wanted, the real problem with Wallace also had these Northern Union guys, ethnics and Catholics, Polish folks and Italian folks of that heritage, Irish. And he was coming through there, and they were really cheering his law and order stands and his attacks on pointy-headed intellectuals and the rest of it. And so what happened, we wanted to win those votes, but those votes left Wallace, but they passed us, and they went to Humphrey.
Okay.
You know, let me tell you, September 1968, 2 months before the election, right after the Democratic Convention in Chicago that exploded.
Yes.
Wallace was at 21, Humphrey was at 28, and we were at 43.
Ooh.
Okay? Wallace in the election lost 8 points, goes to 13. Humphrey picks up 15 points. He got all the undecided, and all the Wallace votes went right by us over to Hubert Humphrey. And I'll tell you, it was nerve-wracking the election day because it was 43-all.
Oh, yes. I was so close. It was so close.
Mm-hmm.
Well, where did this idea of the great silent majority come from? I mean, was that used right during that period?
It was. I had it in a number of memos to Nixon. I said, we got to go for the forgotten Americans, a silent majority, because that was a period. Let's take what happened in '68. It started off
a lot of violence, right?
Oh, the day we announced up in New Hampshire, the Tet Offensive started. I had a brother over in Vietnam. They had the massacre in Hue.
Yes.
George Romney drops out of the race in February. Early March, Gene McCarthy wounds Lyndon Johnson. Bobby Kennedy jumps in. Rockefeller refuses to get in. Then Lyndon Johnson in March, he drops out of the race.
Right.
And then 4 days later, Dr. King is murdered in Memphis. There's riots in 100 cities. And then my alma mater campus at Columbia, it goes up with Mark Rudd and all the demonstrators seizing the offices. And then right after we won the Oregon primary, 1 week later it's the California primary. And a friend called me at 3 a.m. in the morning and said, Bobby Kennedy's been shot. And I called Nixon and he said, I'm already up. David and Julie have informed me and everything. And so then came the convention at Chicago with the Democrats. That whole thing came apart.
Also a lot of violence and a lot of demonstrations.
I was there watching from the 19th floor of what we called...
In your book, which is so great, yeah.
We called the Comrade Hilton Hotel. They had, it was right there at Michigan and Balboa where the cops attacked all those demonstrators. They were an awful bunch, those demonstrators. But they attacked them in the park in what they called a police riot. I was there looking down on it from the 19th floor with Norman Mailer.
Ooh, amazing.
It happenstance. He had walked into our suite there where I was Nixon's eyes and ears.
It's like oral
history. We were having a drink, come on over to the window. And here this explosion takes place.
Did you take pictures? I mean, this was amazing. Well, you wrote that that Nixon and Ronald Reagan, both Californians, had an alliance, and in the mid-'60s, describe that alliance.
Right, and I tell you how I worked back through all now I had 1,000 basis, part of the basis of this book is 1,000 memos. Oh. Quick, some of them were only a paragraph, some of them were 8 pages or 10 pages. But the way I figured it, I've got letters back and forth from Nixon and Reagan, where Reagan is saying, look, these guys are starting out on my behalf. I haven't authorized this.
Okay.
And Nixon saying, I understand that. And then one time, Rockefeller down in New Orleans comes running into Reagan's suite, uninvited, early morning. And Reagan has all his aides sending messages to us. He didn't invite the guy. But I figured it out that it probably at Bohemian Grove, where the Republicans used to gather.
In California?
The great watering hole for the old Republican bulls.
Right.
And that Reagan and Nixon must have cut a deal in 1967 where Reagan said, okay, you go first. We won't split the conservative vote.
Okay.
Goldwater was scared to death of that incident.
Right.
But we won't split the conservative. You go first. And if you've taken out Romney and you've basically swept the field by the second primary, Wisconsin, I'll stay out. But if you're battling, with Romney and, and it's not sure you're going to win it,
then I'll step in.
I'm free to go in.
Yeah.
And Nixon said, you got it. But what we did is we got 70% in New Hampshire and 70% in Wisconsin. So then that's when I got the letters. Nixon was saying, I appreciate what you've done. And Reagan was saying, well, some of my guys were pushing. And so I got the sense that they had a deal.
Yes.
And that was basically surmised. And there's a couple of other memos in there that the way Nixon responded to him, I said, that's very curious. One of them, someone said, it's known that Nixon has talked to Reagan about this and they've got a deal going.
Yeah.
And I sent it in to Nixon and he checked it. And I was, wait a minute, this guy's basically quoting Nixon and he didn't even respond to me. That tells me it's true.
Yeah, that does. Well, you worked for both Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. I mean, how were they similar and how were they dissimilar?
Reagan, let me just say, Reagan, what you see is what you get.
Okay.
I mean, in the sense that Reagan, when you're in the Oval Office with him and talking to him behind the scenes, and he goes out at his press conference, there's a great similarity there. Nixon,
he's the same person.
He's the same person.
Okay.
There's not that much difference.
Okay.
Nixon, when he was out front with his press conference, you get the, the high school elocution contest out here, and you get back in the Oval Office, and Nixon was enormously intellectually awake and alive.
But he was more formal. More formal?
Oh, no, Nixon would not. Nixon formally wore a coat and tie on the beach.
Okay. He was very
had
formal.
His floor-shine shoes on, right?
Yeah, right.
But in the Oval Office, he was always correct, always formal, always a coat and tie. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
that was his demeanor.
It was his demeanor, but Reagan was too. That way.
But more relaxed.
Reagan was more relaxed, and Reagan. Let's take a look at their anger. Reagan's anger it would be like a storm. I was with him at Reykjavik. He came out of that meeting with Gorbachev, and his face was a mask of rage. And we got to the embassy and was cussing and
really,
yeah. And we drove out to Keflavik Air Base, and where all these wonderful folks, airmen and their wives and kids, been waiting for hours because Reagan kept the conference going. But Reagan comes out and starts speaking to him, and the sun comes out. He's holding forth. And I'm on the plane going home. We've just blown up the biggest summit in history. And he comes back, hey, Pat, have I told you the story about me and Jimmy Stewart?
A Hollywood story, that's right.
Yeah, he's telling Hollywood stories. But Nixon was intellectually curious. He was just addicted to politics, policy issues. And all his life, even to the end of his life, he would come down to Washington Circle. There's a hotel right there. And he would invite me down privately, and he would bring me in and he'd question me for an hour. Now, what's going on in the White House? Who's up? Who's down? What is this? What are they moving on? Oh, and all of these things. And Reagan wasn't like that.
Wow.
But they were different. They're both Irish, but Nixon, in some ways was brooded more, I think. Reagan would explode and the storm was over. And then he was happy. He's the Gipper again, right?
He's the Gipper again, that's right. Well, you have said that Nixon was very intellectually curious, alive, and well-read. I don't think the media ever reported it, that he was such an intellectual. Do you?
Oh, he was an outstanding student in college. I think he graduated near the top of his class at Duke. I think Jack Kennedy was a great reader of history. But I think Kennedy himself, as I say in there, Kennedy really thought Nixon was really the class of the league in that Congress and early Congresses where he served.
Yes.
Look, here's a congressman, what was he, 30s or something like that. He's got this icon of the establishment, Alger Hiss, and he's put him right to the wall. Him and Whittaker Chambers,
Yes, that's right.
And you don't get to be, and he was smart and he was tactically brilliant and strategically. How else do you come back from the disaster of '62 in his personal career and the disaster of '64 in the party career, when everyone says the Republican Party is dead? As for Nixon, he's gone. And he put it back together.
He did.
He brought Rockefeller,
with your help.
Chavez. Well, we're bringing the conservatives over. So, but that is it's the story, and it's a remarkable story. His discipline, and the flawless campaign he conducted. And maybe there's luck in there too. Of course, one of the things that happened was the whole country exploded in '68.
Right.
And even Walter Lippmann and these liberal icons were saying, look, Democratic Party's come apart three ways. They can't lead the country.
Right.
They presided over this disaster. They can't end the war.
That's right. And
we need a change. You got to have a change, and the conservatives, maybe the conservatives are the ones to do it.
Well, you have great talent in your book, and you talk about the fact that when Nixon always wanted to surround himself with the best and the brightest. I mean, you mentioned Alan Greenspan. When Nixon first met Alan, he was playing sax in a band and was in the inner circle of Ayn Rand, the author of Atlas Shrugged.
Right.
I mean, how did Greenspan become one of Nixon's top economists?
Well, here's how Greenspan got in touch with Len Garment and Martin Anderson, who was also a libertarian. They were Randians in those days, Ayn Rand. And Greenspan and Garment had played in the same band together, Woody Herman's. And so Greenspan sent in some thoughts and ideas, and he continued to send them to me. And I took one of his memos, and I said to Nixon, I said, this Greenspan is an economist, but he's a very bright guy, and he's really on the mark on a lot of issues. He was writing about the explosions in Watts and things and how you should deal with them. And so I got at the top of my memo from Nixon, maybe I should have a talk with this Greenspan.
Yes.
And there it is. Well, that is, and Greenspan comes in, and then we had a lot of problems in the research and writing shop. Somebody was trying to move in. I said, sir, we got to clear him out of there. Put Greenspan in charge of domestic, and that was it. Greenspan was in charge of domestic research on the ground, and Dick Allen, foreign policy, and I was on the plane, and I was the contact with both of them. And that's how Greenspan began the career that took him to,
just fascinating.
made him the maestro, the head of the Federal Reserve for a dozen years or more.
Incredible. Well, when you look at the time that you were working with Nixon, what do you regret the most? What do you relish the most?
Well, I relished, I guess, well, there's a lot of things. I was with him for 8.5 years. One of the things I certainly do is that marvelous time when we were started out almost alone together, Mrs. Nixon, Rose Woods, and Pat Buchanan. And we had those tremendous comeback, one victory after another, and he's in the White House. And then there are times in there that in the White House that were great times. I remember his great silent majority speech and Spiro Agnew going after the media when he took on the whole liberal establishment and triumphed. And then, of course, there's the tragedy of Watergate. It lasted 18 months of bleeding, and I was there every day of it, and it was very, very bad, very bad. And he was in tough. And then to see him come back after that, and write all these books.
Yes, it was so.
I mean,
it's just
man
amazing.
He's not unflawed, but he has enormous talents and recuperative ability.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we have to let our viewers know where they can find your book.
Well, they can find my book at Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere, and they can find it at Buchanan.org.
Okay.
The Buchanan website, Linda Muller. Go right to that. Tell Linda to send you one.
Okay. Well, it's been great talking to you, Pat. I feel like I've been given a history lesson on what happened in the 60s.
Right. Well, there's so much more. I hope to write a subsequent follow-up book on the presidency.
On Nixon?
Yeah, because this is
before Watergate.
This is the book, the Great Comeback, and then there's the presidency, the huge success in the first term, 49 state victory.
Well, we'll have to have you back again. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.